Hey, everybody. I'm David Nolan. I'm the chair of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences here at RSMAS. We're very fortunate today to have a seminar from one of our own, Professor Cassandra Gaston, who's an assistant professor here in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and at RSMAS. Professor Gaston grew up mostly in the San Diego area, and she went to UCSD, where she got bachelor degrees in biology and environmental science at the same time, I guess. And then she also got a PhD at Scripps in San Diego, which is officially in oceanography, but her work is obviously on chemistry and aerosols. She did a postdoc at the University of Washington for about 3 years, and she became an assistant professor here at the University of Miami in January 2016. Since arriving, she has taught classes, gotten a ton of very expensive equipment in her laboratory, had a bunch of students, all the things that indicate success so far. And another very special thing she's done is taken over the Barbados Atmospheric Chemistry Observatory in Barbados, which was run by Joe Prospero for a long time. And she's continuing the record of measuring dust and other things coming across the Atlantic to Barbados, which sounds like a lot of fun. Probably a lot of work going there, but sounds like fun. So, and with that, I think I'll ask Cassie to share her screen so we can get the title of her seminar up.
All right. Can everyone see everything okay?
Okay, well, I can see it fine. So Cassie, please go ahead.
All right, well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and also for all of you for coming. I know it's fall break, and I appreciate everyone coming to hear about what we've been up to for the past 5 years. So I'm going to speak about the research that we've been doing, really focusing on the role of aerosols, which are particles in the atmosphere, and their role in air quality as well as in biogeochemical cycles and climate. So this schematic just sort of demonstrates the importance of aerosols in climate. So aerosols directly scatter or absorb incoming sunlight. So this is known as the aerosol direct effect. They are also the site which cloud droplets and ice crystals nucleate in the atmosphere. So they play a big role in cloud formation and precipitation. And this is known as the aerosol indirect effect. And then there's also a third impact, which is that aerosols can deposit either nutrients or also toxins to ecosystems that can affect primary productivity. And this has impacts on the uptake of carbon dioxide into both the biosphere as well as into the deep ocean. So what do we understand about aerosols and climate? So if we look at this figure, which we've probably all seen a bunch of times from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have a pretty good understanding of how greenhouse gases behave in the atmosphere and how they affect Earth's radiative balance. But we still have a long way to go when it comes to aerosols. There's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of their radiative impacts, both directly as well as their ability to affect cloud droplets in the atmosphere. And this is a figure from a recent modeling paper that came from Natalie Mahowald's group at Cornell. So this is showing the aerosol direct effects and the cloud albedo indirect effects. So those were from that IPCC report. Then if we also look at that third effect that I just talked about, the biogeochemical cycle effect, we can see that if we put a radiative forcing number on that effect, it's on par with the two aerosol effects. But this is more of an emerging topic, and that's why my group has been so interested in pursuing it. So in addition to affecting climate, aerosols also affect air quality and human health. That's probably more apparent nowadays. That's why we're all sort of virtual right now, is because of the airborne transmission of the coronavirus. And this is because once these particles are emitted into the atmosphere, they are inhalable. And how they affect our bodies really depends on their size as well as their chemical composition. So smaller particles in particular tend to be inhaled deeper into the cardiovascular system, where they could have more adverse effects on human health. And so the EPA actually regulates 7 criteria, pollutants, as part of the Clean Air Act. And this is through the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. And so we regulate ozone, particulate matter with a diameter of less than 2.5 microns. So these are small particles. Your more coarse particles, as well as carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, lead, and nitrogen dioxide. And what I want to point out is this is the NAAQS from 2020. This is showing the number of people living in counties in the US where one or more of these air quality standards was in exceedance. And so you can see that particles and ozone were in great exceedance compared to the other pollutants. And this is something that we see typically in past years as well. And so when I talk about aerosols, this has a direct impact on thinking about those exceedances in terms of PM levels. But what I'm also going to talk to you about today is that aerosols actually have an indirect impact on these ozone exceedances. And so there's been emerging research pointing to reactions called heterogeneous reactions between precursor gases and aerosol particles. And these are being emerging as a major contributor to ground level ozone that's possibly contributing to these exceedance levels in ozone. And that's something that my group has spearheaded that I'll get into today. Okay, so why are we having such a hard time regulating pollution related to aerosols, and why do we still have such a poor understanding of aerosols in terms of their climate properties compared to greenhouse gases? What is it about aerosols that just makes them so tricky? And so what I'm showing here is a cartoon of how we think about aerosols. So one thing that you should first note is I've shown these different aerosol particles to have different colors. This represents different sources, different compositions, and different sizes. And so one thing that happens is once particles are emitted into the atmosphere, they're very dynamic. So one thing that happens is they can fall out of the atmosphere during transport. So larger particles will settle out gravitationally, or they can become incorporated into precipitation. And so that means that particle size and composition is constantly evolving in space and time. Aerosols are also very chemically reactive, and I hinted at that in the previous slide. So what can happen is particles, I'm showing an example of a particle emitted from the ocean. It can react with trace gases, and this can alter the particle's composition, its size, and its radiative properties. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, this can also have downstream impacts on air quality. Okay, so the real issue here is that aerosol size and composition, which is affecting air quality and climate properties, is a moving target. So how do we study something that's so dynamic? So our approach is that we combine laboratory and field measurements. We look at particle size, composition, and chemical reactivity. So why do we do that? The reason why we do that is the field measurements tell us what's actually happening in the real world. And the laboratory measurements allow us to gain mechanistic insight. Can we reproduce what we see in the real world and come up with some sort of rationale for why we're seeing what we're seeing? So once we do that, we then also provide our measurements to the modeling community so that we can update parameterizations both for air quality models as well as for climate models. One thing that's unique about our approach is that we use both single particle and bulk chemical methods. So typically, most groups that look at chemical composition of aerosols will focus on bulk chemical methods, but we also focus on single particle, which is a bit more specialized. And the reason why we do this is because single particle methods are really helpful for fingerprinting aerosol sources. So where is the particle coming from? Is it from the ocean? Is it from a car? Is it from a desert? We can look at composition. We can look at size more accurately. And a really big driving point for doing single particle is we can look at mixing state. So what's mixed with what? And that's going to be really important for constraining some of the properties of aerosols that we're interested in from a climate and health perspective. And so just to give you an idea of what I mean by bulk and single particle, for bulk, what we do is we take a piece of filter paper, we draw a vacuum across it, we collect aerosols from all different sizes and compositions, And then we can look at total amounts from those filters. So we can look at total concentrations of dust or of particular compounds. That's very, very important for looking at atmospheric deposition to ecosystems. For single particle, what we do is we collect particles on grids and perform microscopy. The other thing that we do is we do single particle mass spectrometry, which is a single particle real-time technique. This allows us to distinguish individual particle sources in real time. And then we can also look at those chemical associations or a mixing state to get a better handle on what's controlling either something like cloud droplet formation or nutrient delivery to ecosystems. Okay, so some of the outstanding questions that we've addressed through these methods is we've looked at how the air-water exchange of aerosols affects air quality. And we've mainly focused on looking at harmful algal blooms and whether the toxins that they produce are aerosolized or not. We found that they are. If they have long-term human health impacts through a collaboration with the medical campus, we found that they do. And then our recent paper has shown efficient mitigation strategies to avoid airborne exposure. And this is a recent paper that came out with myself and Haley Moyer as co-first author. I won't get more into this topic, but if you are interested in it, our paper is in aerosol and air quality research. So another research question that we've tackled is looking at how dust can contribute to halogenated precursor compounds that are responsible for ground level ozone formation in urban areas. And I'll get into some of our findings, but the key highlights are we performed the first laboratory study showing that this is a viable mechanism. And then Haley has also done some really nice work teasing out the chemical mechanisms that can get better agreement between our measurements and current air quality models. We've also looked at how dust affects biogeochemical cycles and climate. So Anne Barkley has some really nice work that we're looking to submit very soon, where she's isotopically fingerprinted dust transported to the Amazon to determine its origin. And then I'll talk a lot today about the underappreciated role of non-dust aerosols in nutrient delivery. So first I'm going to get into our measurements looking at the role of dust in ozone pollution. Okay, so those of you who've taken Intro to Atmospheric Chemistry with me, this should look very familiar. But for those of you who haven't, I'll sort of walk you through what's going on here. So this is nighttime chemistry. This happens a lot in wintertime, where you have pollutant nitrogen oxide gases. They can lead to formation of nitrate radical. This can also then lead to formation of dinitrogen pentoxide. So I've highlighted this compound in red because it's going to be a key compound that I talk about. So this builds up in polluted regions, and it's particularly in high levels during winter. So this compound can undergo what's called heterogeneous reactions. So the gas reacts with particles, and you can get two main pathways for this reaction. The first is the formation of nitric acid. So when that happens, you basically lose nitrogen oxides, and this is thought to reduce potential ozone pollution the next day. The second mechanism is the one that I'm going to focus on, which is where dinitrogen pentoxide reacts with particles, and this leads to the formation of nitrile chloride or ClNO2. And I've highlighted this compound in blue. And the reason why this compound is so important is because when it reacts and when it forms from N2O5 in the daytime, it photolyzes, and it gives you a chlorine radical, which then reacts with volatile organic compounds. This gives you peroxy radicals. The bottom line is that this basically kickstarts ozone pollution. And it's very, very efficient mechanism for building up ozone, even in the wintertime when we wouldn't expect ozone pollution to be a major problem. So I've basically combined the daytime and the nighttime mechanism together just so that we can get a handle on what are the different aspects of this chemistry that we should focus on. Okay, so the first is the actual uptake of N2O5 to our particles. So you'll see a couple of plots later on that have this gamma symbol. All this denotes is how efficiently is my N2O5 taken up by particles. The higher the gamma, the more efficient the reaction. The second thing that we're going to focus on is the role of water and chloride. If you don't have chloride, you're not going to form nitrile chloride. So aerosol chloride is really important. Water is also important because if we have a solid particle containing chloride, the reaction also isn't going to happen. So we need the particle to be wet and to have dissolved chloride in it in order to make this chemistry happen. So chloride and humidity or liquid water content are going to be important. And then the last aspect is you'll see a couple plots that have this phi symbol by it. This is a yield parameter. This basically says how much ClNO2 am I making per N2O5 taken up, right? It's basically saying, am I forming ClNO2 or am I forming something else when my N2O5 is taken up? All right, so those are the terminology that we're going to use. Okay, and then also the last component is that the reason why we're caring about this is that this leads to ozone pollution, and that's what this O3 means. Okay, so what do we know about ClNO2? So this is a compound that's only recently been measured in the atmosphere. And it's been measured in near coastal megacities. So this is the first observations of ClNO2. These were done shipboard. And that makes a lot of sense that we would see this in coastal areas because you basically have the ocean as a source of sea salt particles, which have a lot of chloride in them. So you have chloride, if you're near a coastal megacity, you have the pollution, and those are the two main ingredients that you need to facilitate this chemistry. Now, a couple of years later then, there were observations inland. So this was in Colorado, not near an ocean, and there was ClNO2 measured on par with what was measured out on the coast. And this really confused the atmospheric chemistry community. You know, we're not near a coast, so what is the source of the aerosol that's contributing to the formation of ClNO2 in these inland regions? And so this was a head scratcher for a lot of the atmospheric chemistry community. Now, while this was going on, I was actually doing some PhD work looking at the impact of dust emitted from dried out lake beds and how they might impact cloud droplet formation and their water uptake properties. So what's unique about these playas or dried out lake beds is that we find a lot of them in the south and southwestern US in inland areas. This is a figure from this Wurzbau et al. Paper. It's showing the prevalence of these dried out lake beds. So you can see they're found all over the world. They're actually increasing in size because of water use practices. And what was really unique about these lake beds, the chemistry of these lake beds is that they have a lot of chloride in them. And so this was the foundation for the first grant I applied for and got to look at whether these playas could potentially be explaining some of the nitrile chloride that was observed in inland areas. And so what we did to look at this reaction was we first built a laboratory apparatus, and I'll walk you through what we did. So this was work that my postdoc Drew Matru and I did. We built an N2O5 generation system, and then we coupled that with an aerosol generation system. So we used real-world samples collected from different playas. We took the sediment, and then we did a dry generation method. And then after the particles were suspended dry, we conditioned the humidity that they experienced. They then enter an aerosol flow tube where we expose the particles to gases. And then what we do is we quantify the loss of N2O5 and the production of halogen using chemical ionization mass spectrometry. Now, the front end of this apparatus actually was the hardest part. So my postdoc and I went through a lot of iterations and actually came up with an apparatus that gave us extremely stable particle concentrations for the duration of these experiments. And we recently published our design in Aerosol Science and Technology so that other members of the community can duplicate it and use it for their experiments as well. Okay, so once we had our apparatus built and we started doing our experiments, what we did then is we looked at the production of ClNO2, so that's our yields, and that's what's shown in these colored points here. for 8 different playa dust samples, and we did this as a function of relative humidity. I'm also plotting the mass percent of chloride that we quantified, and I'll get into that a little bit later as to why that's important. But the takeaway from this is that we proved our hypothesis. The heterogeneous reactions with playa dust particles can produce nitrile chloride, and they can actually produce it very efficiently. So this is a viable candidate for resolving that discrepancy of what's producing ClNO2 in these inland environments. Okay, so then what we did was we wanted to test whether we could reproduce our results using current parameterizations that are incorporated into air quality models. So what I'm showing here is our yields of ClNO2. This black line with the gray shading is what we would predict based on our bulk chloride to our predicted liquid water content in our particles, because that's what the model relies on. It relies on aerosol chloride and predictions of the liquid water content. And what you can see is that the model is not reproducing our results very well at all. It's mainly over predicting how much ClNO2 should be produced. So why is this? So the first assumption in the model is that halite or sodium chloride is the main chloride containing mineral that's contributing to ClNO2. And that comes from the fact that most of this chemistry has been studied by the ocean. And so this is really nice work that Haley Boyer did in her first year as part of a scanning electron microscopy class. So what she did is she imaged individual playa dust particles, and then she performed energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, or EDX, looking at the composition of those particles. And what you can see is the presence of chloride, but no sodium on these particles. We thought this was interesting because actually magnesium and calcium chloride containing particles take up water much better than sodium chloride. So we thought, well, maybe this is important for explaining our mechanism. And so then what Haley did over the course of a year was she basically binned out the particles that she measured with SEM of particles without chloride, which is shown in red, particles with chloride and sodium in green, so presumably this is sodium chloride, and then particles with chloride but no sodium in blue. And then the ClNO2 yields are shown by these black markers. So what you can see is pretty good agreement between the blue and the black. And you can see that even better in these scatter plots. So if we look at yields of ClNO2 versus sodium chloride particles, the agreement's not that great. But if we look at ClNO2 versus particles with chloride and not any sodium, we see really good agreement. And so this makes sense. What we showed is that these hygroscopic or water-loving chloride-containing minerals, other than sodium chloride, are likely explaining a lot of the ClNO2 that we're seeing. Right, so that was the first part of the model that we tackled. And then the other part had to do with the fact that we had this one outlier that stuck out in our data. So one of these samples did not look like the other. And we wanted to understand a little bit more, why isn't this part of the sample producing ClNO2 when it has a lot of chloride in it? What's going on here? And so we also went back and looked at our data, and we noticed if we compare the mass percent of chloride with the yields, we see these trends where we have this Sulphur Springs sample that has a low mass percent of chloride, but pretty high ClNO2 yields. And then this high mass percent of chloride that has modest ClNO2 yields. And that doesn't fit the bill at all for what the model would predict. And so we started to think about, well, maybe there's something else that's reacting. And that would make sense, right? Because these are real world samples. There's more to them than just chloride and water. And so we started to look through the literature and realized that there was 1 or 2 papers out there that had suggested that clays react really well with N2O5. Well, that makes sense. We would have clays in our dust samples. So what Haley did is she performed X-ray diffraction, which is a technique that allows you to look at the mineralogy of your samples. And so what she showed was that if we look at particles or samples with increasing mineral clay content, we see increased uptake of N2O5 and decreased yields of ClNO2. And so what she showed was that clays can compete with chloride for N2O5 and inhibit the formation of ClNO2. Now, this is really important because this is saying that the model needs to account for these competing reactions if it's going to have accurate forecasts of how this chemistry is affecting ozone pollution. And we would argue that, this chemistry, these competing reactions, is not limited to just fly dust particles, that there's likely other competing constituents and other aerosol particle types that are also going to affect the reactivity of N2O5. So then the final assumption that we tested was whether or not the reaction occurs throughout the whole particle. And the models currently use bulk chemical methods such as ion chromatography to predict ClNO2 formation. And ion chromatography is a bulk method. And if you look at yields of ClNO2 with the chloride content, there's really not a good correlation here. Now, I had done work as a postdoc on this system, and I had speculated that the reaction would occur in the top 2 nanometers of the particle. So it would be a very surface heavy reaction. And so what Haley actually proved through her experiments was that this is indeed a surface reaction. So what she did is she performed single particle mass spectrometry, a single particle technique, and we used very low laser energy to basically target the chemistry of the surface of the particles. And what you can see is that there are 2 trends that show up here. So the first is where we don't need a lot of chloride to produce a lot of ClNO2. And that's what we would expect based on how the model works. But there's a second trend here where you have a very shallow slope and you need a lot more chloride in order to kickstart this chemistry. And these are the same samples that had high levels of clays, as well as organic material that also inhibits the reaction. And so what we showed was that these surface reactions are really important and that these bulk chemical methods just simply don't work for accurately predicting ClNO2. Okay, so that's great that we can do this in the laboratory, but what does this mean for the real world? So I don't know how many of you saw the recent article that came out, it was about a month or 2 ago in CNN. It was talking about the collapse of the Great Salt Lake and how the Salt Lake is shrinking. And I'm actually showing this here in this image where you can see the Salt Lake in 1984 versus 2018. And there's been a lot of articles about how this is creating an ecological collapse, and this has negative implications for tourism. But what we are going to suggest is that we also need to factor in how this is going to affect air quality, right? Salt Lake City is right near this lake. And so we argue that current air quality issues in Salt Lake City, so that's shown in this left-hand picture, and other cities that are nearby these shrinking lakes could be exacerbated because of this chemistry, where we're facilitating not only emission of aerosols from these dried out lake beds, but also kickstarting ozone pollution through the chemical mechanisms explored in our lab. Okay, so then the next area of research that I'm going to focus on is thinking about how dust impacts biogeochemical cycles and climates. So we're going to switch over to thinking about Saharan dust. So I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with Saharan dust if you live in Miami. So in summertime, you might notice that you'll see a hazy sky, or you might get like a red powdery material on your car. That's the dust being transported from the Sahara Desert all the way to Miami. And you notice that it happens in summertime. And that's because of the position of the intertropical convergence zone. So what I'm showing here is dust transport as a function of altitude, latitude, and longitude, and I'm showing seasonal averages. So this is taken from the Calypso satellite, which provides vertical profiles of aerosols. And so what you can see, this red line here denotes the position or average position of the ITCZ. So it's at its northernmost point in the summer, and this is going to facilitate dust transport westward to the Caribbean islands and to the south and southeastern US. And then what happens in the winter is the ITCZ shifts south, and then this facilitates dust transport to South America. Okay, so this has important implications for human health and for climate. I'm going to get into the importance for biogeochemical cycles. So the transport of this dust and how it might impact ecosystems is really well shown in this satellite image. You can see this large plume of dust being transported over the tropical Atlantic Ocean, making its way to South America. Now we understand this phenomenon pretty well in the summertime. And the reason why is because of the Barbados record that Dave mentioned, that Joe Prospero pioneered. So we have an over 50-year measurement record. We understand it very well. We also have a measurement record in Miami that Paquita Zeidelman's group has taken over. And that's really, allowed us to understand this phenomenon. Comparatively, we don't understand the transport of dust to South America very well at all. And that's because we don't have a long-term measurement record. But it's thought to be extremely important because the dust is thought to fertilize the Amazon rainforest and the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And so these are very important ecosystems for thinking about carbon uptake. So I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on Cayenne. So this is a city in French Guiana, which is in the northeastern corridor of South America. And as you can see from the satellite image, it's receiving the brunt of this dust transport. So what we have is a measurement site that's in partnership with Atmo Guyenne, which is a local air quality agency in French Guiana. And we have the same kind of high volume aerosol sampler that's deployed in Barbados. And we collect near daily filters that are shipped periodically to Miami for analysis. So what's really unique about this measurement site is that you can see the tropical Atlantic Ocean in the background. So we're upwind of the city proper. We're within the trade winds, so dust and other aerosols are blown towards us from the ocean. And from looking at the aerosol records since about 2014, we're very confident in saying that we're only really capturing emissions from the ocean and aerosols that are transported from Africa. Now, if we look at what happens to the air masses after they reach our site in Cayenne, from forward trajectory analysis, the air masses end up going into the interior of the Amazon basin. So this is a really great gateway site for understanding what's coming from Africa and making its way towards the Amazon. All right, so a little bit more about how dust impacts biogeochemical cycles and climate. So this dust is transported, as I mentioned, from Africa towards South America, and it can deposit out nutrients to the forests and to the ocean. Now, the chemical form of the nutrients is really important for thinking about biological uptake. In the case of the deposition to forests, it's not terribly important because once the aerosols deposit, they spend a long residence time in the forest. They can undergo chemical processing from biologically inaccessible to accessible forms. It's very different in the case of the ocean because once the particles deposit onto the surface of the ocean, they quickly sink out. So that means that the particles have a very finite amount of time to impact marine biota in the surface ocean. This is where solubility becomes really important. And the chemical form of your nutrients actually does matter. So it's thought that the more soluble the nutrients are, the more impact they're going to have on biological activity in the ocean. Okay, so once our nutrients are deposited, they can stimulate primary productivity. And then this facilitates the drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide into the terrestrial biosphere and into the ocean. Okay, so there's been a lot of hypotheses that dust alone is the main fertilizer of the Amazon basin and the Atlantic Ocean. And it makes sense why from that satellite image that I showed you. There's a lot of dust making its way towards these ecosystems. Now, phosphorus and iron are both very important nutrients for primary productivity. In the Amazon basin, it's a phosphorus limited ecosystem. The tropical Atlantic Ocean is more nitrogen limited. However, phosphorus and iron can help stimulate nitrogen fixation. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on phosphorus, but both nutrients are important. So the Sahara dust contains both of these nutrients, but they're locked up in very insoluble forms. And so in the case of ocean primary productivity, there's been a lot of questions as to how much dust actually impacts these marine ecosystems. Now, there's been laboratory studies that have shown that if you take dust and you react it with things like sulfuric acid, which is an acid that we commonly find in the atmosphere, it's mainly associated with marine biological activity, as well as anthropogenic emissions, you can actually transform these minerals into soluble forms of iron and phosphorus. But it's not clear that that's actually happening during the transport of dust. So it's not clear that the dust is having as big of an impact on marine ecosystems as we think. And the other point to make is that there's more in the atmosphere than just dust, right? There's other aerosol sources that contain iron and phosphorus, such as biomass burning, fossil fuel combustion, biological aerosols, and they contain nutrients that are in much more intrinsically soluble forms. So it's sort of a question of, are we overthinking or giving too much weight to the impact of dust? So to answer this question, my former student who recently graduated, Anne Barkley, she took a year's worth of data collected in KN and first focusing on the dust season. What I'm showing here are measurements. So the red in the top panel is dust mass concentrations. The bottom panel is showing our phosphorus concentrations. So blue is total phosphorus, green is soluble phosphorus. And the green asterisks are data points where the soluble phosphorus was so low that we actually couldn't quantify it. And that's actually going to become important in the story. If you take the green and divide by the blue, you get the black trace, which is the percentage of soluble phosphorus. All right, so let's see if dust is controlling the phosphorus. So what we did then is we took our dust and we compared it to our different metrics for our phosphorus. So our total phosphorus in blue, soluble phosphorus in green, and percent soluble in black. So if we look at the top trace, we see a pretty strong correlation between total phosphorus and dust. And that makes sense. I just said a couple slides ago that dust contains apatite, which has phosphorus in it. If we look at soluble phosphorus versus dust, we get a modest correlation. But we have some spread, so we have some data points where we have high phosphorus solubility, even though we don't have a lot of dust. And if you look at the bottom plot, we see an inverse correlation. Now, this wasn't surprising to us to see this inverse correlation. I can't think of a single data set taken in the field where we haven't seen this inverse relationship. And there's actually two schools of thought as to why this happens. The first is that small dust particles contribute less to the dust mass. And when you have these small particles, they have a high surface area to volume ratio, meaning if you react them with a gas like sulfuric acid, they're going to get processed really efficiently, and you're going to release a lot of soluble nutrients. So in that school of thought, it's all about the dust. The second school of thought is that when you have low dust mass concentrations, you have maybe high of something else, like biomass burning of biological aerosols, and it's providing the highly soluble nutrient in that case. So it's ambiguous, right, from what I've just shown you, which school of thought is correct. So to answer this question, what we did then is we compared our measurements during dust season with measurements taken during non-dust season. And so the measurements or the colors take on the same meaning as in the previous slide. And what you can see is that our dust has fallen by over an order of magnitude. But what was really surprising to us is that our total phosphorus only decreased by about a factor of 2. So that was really surprising to us. And our soluble phosphorus didn't decrease that much. So again, if we perform the same correlation analysis, we see that the total phosphorus is kind of being driven by the dust, but the dust can't explain all of the phosphorus that we're seeing during the season. And it certainly isn't explaining the soluble phosphorus. So this is strongly suggesting that there's another aerosol source that's supplying highly soluble phosphorus during non-dust season and possibly during dust season as well. So I'll cut the suspense and get right into the conclusion, which is that we concluded that biomass burning transported from Africa was providing the soluble phosphorus that we saw. And I'll walk you through our logic. So what I'm showing here are air mass back trajectory plots. What this is basically telling you is, where is the air mass coming from that I sampled at my measurement site in KN? So in winter and spring, the air masses are coming from Northern Africa. That makes sense. We're transporting Saharan dust to our site. In fall, the air masses are coming from Southern Africa. Now, the reason why that's important is because if we look at this figure from this Roberts et al. Paper, they looked at remote sensing data to look at the seasonality of biomass burning in Africa. Most of the biomass burning in Northern Africa is occurring in winter and spring, and the biomass burning in Southern Africa is occurring in summer and fall. And that tracks really well with where we're receiving our air masses. So it's possible that we're receiving year-round transport of African biomass burning. And as I mentioned a few slides ago, biomass burning has much more soluble phosphorus in it than dust. So further evidence that we're getting transport from biomass burning can be shown in scanning electron microscopy. So I think these actually might be the very first measurements that Anne ever took in my group before we had any equipment in my lab. So you can see on a representative filter the presence of dust and soot particles, so soot being indicative of biomass burning. And then in fall, we mainly saw biomass burning particles. So this doesn't completely rule out a local source of biomass burning. Remember, the Amazon also experiences its burn season too. So to really conclude that this is coming from long-range transport, what Anne next did was she took this air mass spec trajectory analysis and coupled it with remote sensing analysis. So what she did is this red line is showing where the air mass came from, right, in space and time and in altitude. And then these boxes indicate time periods where the Calypso satellite, which as I mentioned provides a vertical profile of aerosols, intersected our air mass as it was making its way towards KN. So going further back in time, this black box indicates our air mass as it's making its way from the coast of Africa. So what you can see at this point in latitude and longitude is an elevated smoke plume that's overriding the marine boundary layer. Now, if we look at the green box, so moving a little bit further up in time, we again see the same elevated smoke plume. Now, this elevated smoke plume makes its way all the way to our measurement site in KN. And every day in fall, when we had high levels of soluble phosphorus, we saw these transport conditions, suggesting that indeed, this is smoke plumes transported from Southern Africa, providing highly soluble phosphorus in fall. Now, in days when we didn't observe high levels of soluble phosphorus or measurements were below the limit of quantification, what we noticed is that those smoke plumes started to thin out on their way as they were being transported to our measurement site. So again, providing further evidence that the long-range transport from Africa is really dictating the soluble phosphorus that we're seeing in our site. Okay, so once we determined what was determining our phosphorus measurements that we saw at our site, we then worked with Natalie Machelwald's group at Cornell to look at what the ramifications were of our measurements. So what she did was she took our measurements and tuned her model, the CAM model, and she looked at the fraction of phosphorus deposited to the whole Amazon basin from biomass burning from African smoke, so that's shown in blue, and then African dust in red. And I'm showing this as a function of month. Now, total phosphorus is on the left, soluble phosphorus is on the right. So what we can see is that the biomass burning from Africa is providing up to half of the total phosphorus and almost all of the soluble phosphorus deposited to the Amazon. Now, why that's significant is if we go back to the traditional school of thought, we'd only factor in this red line. And so that means that by not factoring in this biomass burning coming in from Africa, we could be severely underestimating the total phosphorus that's being deposited to this ecosystem from the atmosphere. Okay, so then what we did is we performed the same thought experiment for the ocean. Now this is going to look a little bit different because what I'm showing here is the global ocean. So we did not tune these model runs to our measurements because our measurements, right, are upwind of the Amazon, but they're not upwind of the whole global oceans. And so what this is showing is the percentage of soluble phosphorus. Remember, solubility is important for the ocean, deposited from smoke compared to soluble phosphorus from all other sources. And we're showing this as a percentage. So if we look at the southern half of the tropical Atlantic Ocean, sorry, there we go. If we look at the southern half of the tropical Atlantic Ocean, we see that smoke from both South America as well as Southern Africa is providing a lot of soluble phosphorus, and that's something that we would expect. But what was really unique to us was that we're seeing smoke providing soluble phosphorus in the northern half of the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And we wouldn't expect this at all if it was all about the dust. And remember, we didn't tune the model to our measurements, so we're likely underestimating the impact of the biomass burning in this model run. And so what we estimated is that the biomass burning from Africa is providing on the order of 20 to 60% of the soluble phosphorus deposited to the tropical Atlantic Ocean. Now, the other thing that jumps out to you from this model run is that it's more than just tropical ecosystems that are being impacted. There's also this tail of smoke coming from Southern Africa that's also impacting both the Indian Ocean and parts of the Southern Ocean. So the reach of the smoke is having a more significant impact on just the tropical ecosystems. And so we need to consider how this might also impact nutrient deposition to places like the Southern Ocean. So if we go back to our traditional school of thought, and we look at this as sort of a schematic where dust is basically driving all of these biogeochemical cycles, what we've shown in our work is that we kind of need to update this picture to look something more like this. And this is actually an infographic that Anne designed. And this is showing the smoke and the dust providing phosphorus and it being deposited to both the Amazon as well as the tropical Atlantic Ocean and affecting marine productivity. So what have we learned from this? So what we've learned is that from our first part of the talk that I went through with the air quality issues is that aerosol composition and surface reactivity are really important for thinking about gas particle reactions and for predicting ozone pollution, but they're not currently accounted for in air quality models. And we need to be thinking about updating these parameterizations because we're seeing an expansion of these desiccated lake beds, most notably the Great Salt Lake. And this is because of increasing diversion of water from lakes to provide water to an increasing population. And so our research is showing that this is going to have really important impacts on air quality that we need to be thinking about. What we've shown also through that work is that providing single particle measurements as a complement to bulk chemical approaches really improves our understanding of the chemical mechanisms that are going on and explaining, in that case, the production of nitrile chloride. And I would argue more broadly that this is providing a more realistic picture of how the radiative properties of aerosols evolve in space and time. We also learned from the second half of my talk that dust is not the only important source of nutrients for fertilizing the Amazon. We showed that African biomass burning is providing up to half of the phosphorus deposited to the Amazon. So just focusing on the dust, we really might underestimate the importance of atmospheric deposition. And also because the biomass burning is so much more soluble than the phosphorus and dust, we argue that this source might be more important for marine productivity, not just in tropical ecosystems, but also in high latitude oceans as well. More broadly, what we've learned is that the roles of aerosol source and composition and mixing state are underappreciated, but they're really important for being able to improve our forecasting abilities of air pollution, as well as thinking about how atmospheric deposition affects biogeochemical cycles, productivity, and carbon uptake. So what does the future hold? Where are we going with this? So what we're doing now is we are expanding our laboratory studies to think about how our work impacts the real world. So we're planning field measurements in Salt Lake City to see if indeed the dust emitted from the drying Great Salt Lake is explaining some of the ozone issues that are being experienced in that area. We're also looking at whether playa dust is the only contributor. I mean, my sense is no, but there's a whole swath of other aerosols that we need to be thinking about that are playing a role. We're also looking at whether our results that I showed in KN apply more broadly to other ecosystems. So asking the question, is smoke always more important than dust for nutrient delivery? And so we're starting to also expand our capabilities beyond phosphorus to also look at iron solubility during dust as well as biomass burning transport events. We're also looking more carefully at whether the dust undergoes chemical aging or not during transport. So we suggested that biomass burning was more important than dust, but there might be cases where the dust actually does interact with polluted air masses and is processed with those acidic gases. And so what we're doing is we're collecting measurements in Barbados, which is relatively clean, and comparing them to measurements in Miami, which experiences more pollution, to look at whether there's different chemical aging mechanisms occurring in dust particles and how that affects nutrient solubility. We're also looking at how nutrient solubility translates to bioavailability. This is a really important question. The atmospheric community is very tied to thinking about solubility, but that doesn't really tell us if the biota are actually going to take up our nutrients and as a consequence sequester carbon. And so what we're doing is we're performing incubation experiments in collaboration with Kim Poppendorf's group. All right, so I just want to acknowledge funding sources that have supported all of this work. And most importantly, I want to acknowledge my group members who have just been absolutely fantastic and have made all the research that I showed possible. And I'd be happy to take any questions. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Cass. Let's see here. Okay. I have a question. So you were showing the plots comparing the total phosphorus and soluble phosphorus to dust. Can you go back to those slides?
Sure.
What I was confused about is you're showing the correlations or not of this phosphorus to the dust.
Right.
But okay, I guess I'm confused because if the phosphorus were just in the dust, then if you had more dust, you'd have to have more phosphorus, right?
Yes, and there is.
So where's the phosphorus separate? Is it set in the air separate from the dust, or it's in the dust?
No, it's a part of the dust. So the dust is composed of minerals that contain phosphorus.
So if the dust goes up in amount, like micrograms per cubic meter there, how do both of those curves not go up? How can one be flat? If the SP is coming from the dust too, and you had twice as much dust, why don't you have twice as much SP?
That's a good question, right? And so if you look back at our previous data, right, notice the difference in scale, right? We're going up to 140 micrograms per cubic meter, right, of dust. And then during non-dust season, we're only going out to about 16, right? So what we're saying is that, yeah, there's a little bit of a dust increase during this season, but it's not explaining all of the phosphorus that we're seeing. There's other contributing aerosol sources that are providing the phosphorus.
Okay.
And that's what we believe is coming.
But you're making a bulk measurement of what's in the air.
Yes.
Yeah. See, I think what's confusing is this isn't coming only from the dust, it's coming from what's in the air. Some is dust, some is the biomass burning.
Right. But that's the thing though, is the traditional school of thought would tell you the dust is going to dictate everything that we see in this measurement site. It's all about the dust, right? And so what we're arguing in this work is that there's other stuff in the atmosphere, just as you pointed out. We're not just collecting dust particles that are being transported, and that's been overlooked for thinking about how the atmospheric deposition is affecting these ecosystems.
Okay. Well, there must be other questions. So anybody else, please.
I have a question. Do you expect the forest burning in the US to have a similar impact in releasing biomass and fertilizing places?
Yeah, so that's actually something that people have been looking at, particularly looking at high altitude alpine lakes. They've been looking at how phosphorus from biomass burning might be affecting the nutrient balance and whether that's affecting some of these ecosystems. One thing that I'm actually interested in is whether some of the burning that we have in Florida is impacting presence of harmful algal blooms and things like that.
Nice. Very nice presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Can I ask a question here?
Please.
Oh, do I show up or what? No.
We see you, Professor Hines. Go ahead, and we
Okay,
can hear
all
We
you.
right.
see you.
So, okay. So, you know, one of the issues about the production of chlorine atoms is that they react extremely rapidly with methane that's, you know, present at 1.8 parts per million, much higher concentrations than any other reactive hydrocarbons, where, you know, whereas OH reacts very slowly with methane, but fast with other guys. So in this Salt Lake City smog, are you proposing that it's basically methyl peroxy? Would methyl peroxy be the dominant organic peroxy compound?
Possibly, but you also have to remember, like, we're also looking at a very urban area. There's also been a lot of recent work where other groups, I believe, Leah Hildebrand Reese has focused a lot on looking at how OH radical versus the chlorine radical compete with some of these other more anthropogenic VOCs that you would find in these urban areas. And what she's found is that the chlorine radicals are super reactive with some of these other VOCs, including isoprene. And so what we're arguing is that if you go into these urban areas where you have the nitrogen oxides, you have this soup of volatile organic compounds, and you are bringing in the chloride containing aerosol from the Salt Lake City, you have all the right ingredients to enhance ozone pollution in a season when you wouldn't expect to see enhanced ozone pollution during the winter. That's what we think. And that's what we want to show with the dedicated field experiments in Salt Lake City.
Because the issue obviously is chlorine reacts very rapidly with these, but it's the difference in concentration, you know, 1.8 parts per million that reacts rapidly with something is a huge sink, you know, which brings me to something then that doesn't react rapidly with methane. So has anybody looked at nitrile bromide? Is that, you know, with these lakes produce a lot of bromine. So
yeah, so we actually, so I didn't mention this during my talk, but if you look back at our plots, we actually looked at BR2 and we weren't able to quantify it, but we also saw production of BRNO2. And to the best of our knowledge, this is the first measurements of BRNO2 being produced from real world samples. So not like something that you would buy off of the shelf from Sigma Aldrich for a non-polar environment. So yes, we did see production of brominated compounds. And absolutely, that would have major ramifications for thinking about ozone budgets, because you've got the chlorine that's going to want to react with the VOCs, but then you have the bromine that's going to want to react with the ozone and chew it up.
So, and just one more thing. So, are you going to have anybody with a DOAS at this Salt Lake City experiment?
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're hoping to piggyback with the Aquarius field campaign. So there's a recent paper that came out from Gannett Haller in BAMS. So myself and Carrie Pratt are co-authors on it, and we're doing the dedicated CLNO2 work. But there's going to be a big team of measurements aimed at understanding wintertime air quality issues in places like Salt Lake City. So yeah.
Thanks. Great talk.
Thank you.
More questions for the speaker? I think there's a question in the chat from Kurt Hansen. It says, is there a way to tell the source of the biomass burning through the chemical or biological composition of the aerosol samples?
That's a really great question. So that is pretty tricky to do, especially because once the smoke reaches our site in Cannes, it's pretty aged. So getting a clear signature where we can identify, this is definitely coming from this region, would be pretty tricky to do from a chemical standpoint. This is where the remote sensing products were really key for teasing out the long range transport versus the more local source.
Any others? Anyone else? Good, because I have one more question.
Please.
So, I mean, this obviously reflects, my lack of training in chemistry and biology, and so, it's hard to get a sense of scale, right? Is it really the case that like dust, which is a lot of stuff, but compared to what's in the ground, it's a very small amount of stuff, is actually, say, critical or important for, as you say, fertilization in the Amazon? Like, are they really missing that nutrients so much that the tiny, tiny little bits of dust that are raining down every year compared to like just what's in 1 inch of soil actually matters?
Yeah, actually it is for both the Amazon as well as the open ocean. So Amazon, like other tropical forests, is actually very phosphorus limited. And so the dust is a really key external source or new source of phosphorus that does play a key role. There actually was a recent paper that came out from Avner Gross's group where they showed more definitively the uptake of phosphorus from dust into different plants and showing that the dust is actually quite important. From a open ocean perspective, you're away from sort of coastal sources from rivers, and you're also away from upwelling regions in some parts of the ocean. And so this external source is actually very important. And there have been correlations between atmospheric transport and enhancements in chlorophyll. So there was actually a recent paper that just came out a few weeks ago in Nature showing biomass burning from the Australian fires from 2019, fertilizing productivity in the ocean as well.
Okay, I mean, the ocean makes more sense to me because there's no solid stuff there, right?
Yeah.
But in the Amazon, there's rocks and dirt and trees. But anyway, I'm gonna acknowledge your expertise in that area. So, okay, unless anybody jumps up right now and has something to say, then I want to thank Cassie for a really engaging talk. That was really interesting, and thank everybody for coming. It's a very nice seminar, and everybody have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.